Okay, I have up on the board the individual that we have been talking about, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which many individuals, not only the Jews, because of his erratic, I guess is the best way to put it, behavior, was called Epimanes. Epiphanies means God manifest, or God manifest in the flesh is exactly what it lends itself to mean. But they called him Epimanes, which means the mad one, lending itself to the idea that he was not in his right mind. And he was an individual of history that was erratic in his behavior, that many individuals did not like the way he conducted himself, and he could not be trusted in many different ways. So he was not liked by many individuals of history. Okay, as we went through the last 2 weeks of talking about how Daniel was told of I forgot to bring up the text. The vision that he saw, and that he was going, and the interpretation of that vision being of the ram and the he-goat, and the he-goat coming down upon on the ram with great fury, and eventually the great horn on that he-goat was broken, and I'm not good at multitasking here, am I? Okay. That the he-goat came upon the ram with his fury, and when he was in his full power, the great horn was broken, and in his stead 4 other horns grew in his place, and out of one of those 4 kingdoms that would grow up out of that. Now, I intended to bring the book, and I forgot to do it. The Watchtower, which we know of as the Jehovah's Witnesses, produced a book, and the book of Daniel and things of this nature. It's interesting to read their take on Daniel chapter 8. And I don't want to make fun of any individuals, but they are just one of several dispensational premillennialists that teach different things on the book of Daniel and then Daniel chapter 8. And they very quickly take Daniel chapter 8, and all of a sudden, without any evidence whatsoever, they're talking about Great Britain and the offshoot of Great Britain, which is the United States, and that being the 5th kingdom of the 10 kingdoms of chapter 7, and they're gone with it. And they have no evidence whatsoever to back that up. They just start talking about it. See? And so what I want you to take from that and understand from all of this is, when you get to talking to a dispensational premillennialist, and there are many different flavors of those individuals, by the way, if you will come back to the text and see what the text says, it talks about 2 kingdoms, that being Medo-Persia, and it identifies Medo-Persia and Grecia. And out of them who? Out of Greece, out of the Greek Empire, then arises this little horn. So they can take it any direction they want to go, but the text says, the interpretation says this. So we need to be firm in our understanding of what Daniel is told. Now, horns are horns, but the horns of one chapter don't mean the same thing the horns of another chapter. And they will try to mix and match all of those things and say it's the same thing all the way through. It is not the same thing all the way through. So each chapter has to be taken as a chapter, and you have to take the interpretation of each chapter on its own. So be very wary when you talk to these individuals. They'll try to get you confused, and just go back to the text. The text itself explains these things. Just like in verse 20 it says, the ram that thou sawest had two horns, the kings of Media and Persia. It explains who these individuals are. We don't have to be confused. If you want to be confused, you can listen to anybody you want to, and they'll take you down any road that you want to go down. But the scriptures are clear. The rough he-goat is the king of Grecia, verse 21. Okay, so we can know who he is talking about, all right, in some of these things. So, again, verse 23, in the latter time of their kingdom, of the Greek kingdom. That's who he's talking about. We just follow English. English words have meanings, and if you follow the English, if you follow the original Hebrew language, you just follow what is being said, things are understood. But if you want to take everything out of context and then try to take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and mix it with this and go over to Revelation and put it over here and do this and that and the other, have it your way is not the way the Bible was written. A smorgasbord is fine when you go out to eat. If you want to have some chicken and some pork and a little bit of this and a little bit of that and put a little bacon on everything, that's fine when you go out to a smorgasbord. But that's not the way the Bible is written. There are rules of language. The Bible is one of the most logical books ever written, and you have to use logic when you read it and when you follow through on it. But if you're not a logical person and do not follow rules of logic, you're going to get messed up very quickly. Okay, we've been following this individual in history, and I hope I'm not losing you when I'm talking about it, but we got last week Antiochus Epiphanes about 176 about year 176 on our history. Antiochus Epiphanes had gone down into Egypt, and remember, by bribery he had changed the who was the high priest. Now, one of the things that we had not mentioned, but is obvious when we talk about that, is the high priest office now, from this point on, up until the time of Christ, is not only a position of being the high priest, it is now a position of being the most authoritative individual in all of Judea. Okay? At some point, a little bit later, because of the Maccabean revolt, he'll become king. He'll have a title of king for a little while. And the Jews will enjoy a certain amount of autonomy. But that's only going to last for about 100 years, and then that's going to go away when Pompey comes in and takes over all of Judea, and that they no longer have that title. Okay, they no longer have that autonomy. They're under Roman rule from that point in time. And you remember who they're under when Christ is around, and that's Pilate. Okay? But he's just one of the many governors that they are under. It just happens to be when Christ is crucified, he's under Pilate. So they have some autonomy under the Roman rule in the time of Christ, but they do not have full autonomy. But the high priest is the highest governing authority under Jews. Now, he is not necessarily of the lineage of Aaron anymore. He is a person who has been put in that position by who? Whoever's in power. Just like we see here, he'll be put into power by Antiochus. He is still, this particular individual happens to be of the Levitical lineage, but it doesn't necessarily have to fall into that, and they'll have wars and problems with that throughout the history of the priesthood. So some people will accept it, some people won't accept it, and there's going to be issues about that throughout the rest of the history of the Jews now from this point forward. Okay, so it's a political appointment, and it's also a position of being almost king.
And it's during a time when God's not speaking to the people. It's perhaps why God told Daniel this now, because when all this was to come to pass, the only thing the Jews were going to have was the prophecy. God had stopped talking to them until the time of John the Baptist. And so during this time, and it should, the fact that the high priest was no longer, it wasn't God's high priest anymore. It wasn't according to the right lineage, and God wasn't talking to them anymore. It just showed that things were about to change.
Correct. So there's a lot of problems with it doesn't fall under the lineage of Aaron necessarily anymore. Okay. All right. I just wanted to mention that because that has some effect of what we see happening in the first century under Jesus as you follow that down. Okay, so we talked about last week under the first time that Antiochus goes down to Egypt. He is successful in Egypt, but the young king down there appeals to Rome. He goes back home. On his way back through, he causes the Jews a certain amount of heartache. He puts Menelaus, that should be an E here instead of a C, Menelaus, if I'm saying it correctly, I'm sure I'm not, back in as high priest because Jason forces him out. So there's, that office is under constant turmoil. And it was all set up because Antiochus put that in as a bribery office, right? If you pay me enough money, I'll make you high priest. All right, so one guy overbid the other, and they're brothers. These two individuals are brothers. Jason and Menelaus are both brothers. Okay? All right, so now down in 168, if I can do that without making your eyes pop out, his second campaign into Egypt, he goes down there, and here's this Roman that stands in his way, Pompilius Lanus, if I'm saying that right, meets him and tells him he doesn't want him to come down and bother them down in Egypt anymore. Well, what's Rome's stock in Egypt? You know? It's the breadbasket of the world. That's where all the wheat comes from. They haven't taken over Rome. Rome hasn't taken over Egypt at this time. They don't really want to at this time. But they don't want to stop any of the flow of food that comes up out of Egypt. They want them to be left alone and let make certain the food still keeps flowing to Rome and to the rest of the world. So they don't want all these constant wars going on, which interrupts all that. So they want peace. So he tells Antiochus to not come down here anymore. And Antiochus says, well, I'll think about it. And so he draws a circle around him. Some people say he draws a circle around him in the sand with a sword. Some people said he did it with a stick. I don't know. I wasn't there. I didn't see it, so I can't tell you which it was. But anyway, the indication is if he steps out of that circle without giving the Roman ambassador an answer, he has just declared war with Rome. Not a good position to be in. Not at this point in time. Rome has shown itself already to be a force to be reckoned with. And so he tells him no, he'll leave Egypt alone. And so now he's been humiliated. In front of all of his army, in front of everyone else, his generals and everyone else, he's been humiliated. So now when he goes back home, where does he pass through? On his way to Syria. Oh, he died. Where does he pass through? Jerusalem, Palestine. He's got to go right directly through Palestine in order to get there, so he takes out all of his vengeance on the Jews. And evidently it was quite bad. According to Flavius Josephus, there were something in the neighborhood of 40,000 individuals on just that one occasion that either lost their lives or were sold into slavery. And so you have this contingent of individuals, as we talked last week, that wanted that the gymnasium in Jerusalem, the Greek way of learning brought into Jerusalem. Now you have to remember too, I didn't mention this last week, that under Ptolemy the first, the very first individual that owned Palestine, he was in Egypt. He supplanted or moved a bunch of Jews down into Alexandria, the city of learning. Also the reason why the Septuagint version was translated in Alexandria at that time, into the Greek language. Okay? So there is a large contingent of Jews that are very enamored with the Greek way of life and the Greek way of learning. And Alexandria, even at that time, was the most learned city of the world. And so all this learning and all this idea of scholarship and all this type of stuff sweeps a lot of people off their feet, doesn't it? So they begin to be enamored with Greece, or not Greece, or at least the Greek idea of thinking and learning and education, and that being a means all by itself. And so they bring that back to Jerusalem, and so there's a lot of Jews that are now enamored with that way of thinking. And so now we see how now Jerusalem is split up between those Jews who have now become what's the right term? Fallen away from the law of Moses and now taken on the Greek culture. So you have two complete two different ways of thinking now. And so it set that up. And some of the Jews actually fought with Antiochus the second, or Antiochus the fourth, and so that it ends up that way. So this sets up a time for Simon Maccabees, the youngest son of Matthias. You'll remember there was Matthias, Simon, there's Judas Maccabees. There were several Maccabees, all sons of Matthias Maccabees. And they all fight against Antiochus. I believe it was Judas Maccabees that thought he had Antiochus pinned in one of his elephants, one of his war elephants. He ran to him, shoved his sword into the elephant, and killed the elephant, and it brought the elephant down upon him, and he died under the elephant. But sure enough, Antiochus was not on that particular elephant. They were able to bring that elephant down and kill everybody on it, but he wasn't on that elephant. He was on a different elephant at that time. So I believe it was Judas Maccabees. But anyway, Matthias and his revolt, Matthias started the revolt, and he was an older man. His sons, and you can read about that if you read the Apocrypha, the apocryphal books, the first and second Maccabees, and you can read some of that in Josephus as well, about how they fought. And eventually they win rule, independence from Maccabean rule. And the Roman Senate in 139 recognizes Jewish autonomy. And so that's what they wanted all along anyway, is this autonomy, be able to rule themselves, judge themselves, and they think they've won it. They're on their way. They're just waiting now for the Messiah to come and set up the kingdom as they see the kingdom going to be. So again, that adds the flavor to the New Testament, doesn't it? That period of time, they're just waiting for him. Now, everything is just right. They just need a Messiah to rise up, and now the kingdom is here, right? And so they're waiting for that physical kingdom. So that's a lot of background to that if you don't see that background, you probably don't understand what's happening in the first century when Jesus comes on the scene. Then one of the sons of the Maccabean boys, John Hyrcanus, he comes high priest and prince. And then, let's see how far it comes down there. It's in 76. He wins the kingship. Salome Alexandra, she appoints her son the kingship. And so now they actually have a king on the throne for a short period of time. And that's not far from our Lord, see? And that continues for a short period of time until Pompey comes on the scene, and then he takes Jerusalem, and then it's under Roman rule from that period of time. So they're trying to win back that kingship by the time our Lord comes on the throne. So that gives you some background about all of that. Okay. So Antiochus, coming back up here under the Maccabean revolt, Antiochus dies in 164. Now notice in our text it says that he would die without hand. Remember that? Seems that Antiochus the fourth gets some type of terrible disease of the stomach. And there's several commentators have no idea exactly what it was, but evidently it was a terribly horrible thing that he had that caused him to bloat up, and they don't know if he had worms, or if he had what he had that was eating up his stomach, but he was in terrible shape. Some people said that he, on one of his trips, he fell out of the chariot and he died there in terrible, wretched pain. But a fitting end for an individual that was as wretched an individual as what he was. But nonetheless, he didn't die in battle. He didn't die of any, he didn't die a normal death by any stretch of the imagination. He died a pretty horrible death from all accounts. So he died without hand, as it were. So if we go back to our text, then we only have one question to answer here. So we understand what it means now, a king of fierce countenance, understanding dark sentences. He was an individual who did everything by I kept using the word subterfuge, but that's not the word I want to use. It's through bribery and things of this nature, is how he got his power. Okay? He shall destroy wonderfully and shall prosper and practice and destroy the mighty and holy people. So we understand he did a lot of damage to the Jews, but it was because the Jews were not following God's law. They were practicing the ways of the Greeks. And through his policy, he will cause craft to prosper. In other words, he was crafty. He was using his policies and bribery and things of this nature in order to get things done. And he would stand up against the prince of princes. One of the things that I forgot to mention is on his way back through Jerusalem on his second foray down to Egypt, was that he sacrificed pigs upon the altar in the temple, had them do that for days on end, and pig's blood. So the temple was completely profaned. It couldn't be used for the worship of Jehovah. Also, he set up an idol of the Greek god, one of the Greek gods. I can't think of his name right now. At that time, as well, for worship. So the temple was profaned completely; could not be used. All right. And that's what this means. He shall stand up against the prince of princes. He should stand up against God himself. And then we just talked about he would be broken without hand. Again, he died of a horrible death. He didn't die in battle. He didn't die of his own hand or any other thing. He died of a terrible disease of some sort. Okay, the vision of the evenings and the mornings is the thing that we need to talk about. All right, it tells us back up here, talking about the sanctuary, it would be 2,300 days, and then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Well, after our discussion in chapter 7 about 2,300 days, what is 2,300 days? Anybody ever do the math on that? That'd be 6 years and 4 months, which would be just short of a what? Just short of a 7. So there's several different ways that people look at this. Several commentators suggest that it means exactly 2,300 days. It means exactly that period. because it talks about down here in the interpretation, the vision of the evening and the morning was told as true. Okay, so how long did Antiochus trouble or persecute the Jews at that period of time? Was it 6 years and 4 months? Well, it's real hard to get an exact period of time, but some calculate it was about that period of time, about 6 years and 4 months. But we don't know exactly for sure. I mean, we can't really calculate that time because we don't have exact records. But there are those that would say that. There's an individual, what's his name? It said it started in April of 170 and concluded in August of 640 BC when he died. I'm trying to think of his name. Trying to find his name and I can't see where this individual's name is in this college. Ted Stewart suggests this. Well, he could well be right. I don't know. Others suggest that it's under, since it's just under a 7, that he was just short of being able to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish, which was basically destroy the Jews. This persecution was pretty severe. There was a lot of Jews that were killed, sold into slavery. I mean, some of the things that he did, I mean, we talked about, fastening a baby around the women's neck and then flinging him off the wall. I mean, this is pretty horrible stuff. This is not normal persecution. This is pretty horrible things that he was doing. And that was just some of the stuff. So, 40,000 people at one time, and that was just one of the times. I don't know how many people total was either killed or taken into slavery. There was a large number of people that were persecuted and put into slavery, and this is not normal. This ranks along some of the worst characters that we can find in history. This individual was not in his right mind. So, nonetheless, whichever it would be, I don't think he understood individuals that are true to God will do whatever they have to do, will suffer whatever they have to suffer, and will come back. There always are those remnants, like the Maccabees, that will fight no matter what. There's always been Christians that would hide in the catacombs throughout the Dark Ages. I mean, we can always find those few individuals, and it may be just a few, but there's always a few that will remain true to God. Now, Elijah thought he was the only one left, but he was taught he wasn't the only one left. There are some that will remain true to God. So he tried to be victorious over the Jews, but he wasn't. God's people, there are some of God's people who will remain true to him.
I think at that time, I think it's fair to say that the Jewish system was already over. In essence, I mean, their high priest, it wasn't God's high priest, so they weren't worshiping the way God said to do it. The pig's blood was just the temple was already profaned in other ways, and I think you see the transformation between it was more of a political state than a spiritual state. The Maccabees were more fighting for political freedom rather than anything else. And so the Jewish system had already, I mean, it it was very close to death anyway. The only reason, really, that anybody of that lineage was spared was to bring about Christ. That's really all that mattered from that point on, because the Jewish system was on its way out, basically at the end. And the only reason for a Jew was to make sure that Mary and Joseph were Jews, were of that lineage.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, it's interesting. That message, you can see why Daniel would have thought that message. I mean, I think he understood. This means that he didn't understand it totally, because he was only seeing, he didn't see
He
all
only
of
saw
it.
part of it, yeah.
But I think he understood what was being said. He saw this is coming to an end. And he didn't get it all. But that would have been a very, very heavy message to him.
Which leads us to the end. I know I'm a little over. Which leads us to the end of what we see here. It says, Daniel fainted and was sick certain days. Well, you can understand why he was sick. He saw a vision of persecution of God's people. And so, yeah. But at the end, he got up, he did the king's business, and was astonished at the vision, but he didn't fully understand what he was shown. And you can understand why he wouldn't understand it. He would think that God's people would go on forever, the Jewish people would go on forever, but they weren't intended to go on forever, just as you was indicating. So, anyway, it was tough for Daniel to take. It would be tough for any prophet to take. Anyway, next week we will go on to chapter 9. If you have any questions at all, bring them up next week. We'll answer them before we go into chapter 9. Thank you very much for your kind attention.